Welcome, brave traveler of time, to a journey through the darkest plagues of the Middle Ages. In this video, we'll dive into the horrors of 4 legendary pandemics that made medieval life more terrifying than a haunted castle. First up, the Black Death, a disease so brutal it wiped out a third of Europe. Think rats, fleas, and a complete lack of personal hygiene. Sounds fun, right? But don't worry, we'll sprinkle in some humor to keep your soul intact. We'll uncover how entire towns vanished, how doctors looked like bird-wearing cosplayers, and why medieval people thought beating themselves with sticks would please the divine. So before the chaos begins, hit that like button like you're swatting a plague-carrying flea, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next epidemic, and leave a comment if you've ever blamed your bad day on a rat. Now grab your torch and follow us into the gloom of history, where the only thing spreading faster than disease was panic. Ikar Mami. To understand how the Black Death kicked off its European tour, we first have to zoom out, way out, to 14th century Asia. Somewhere between the Mongol Empire, silk caravans, and an unhealthy amount of rat traffic, the infamous Yersinia pestis bacterium made its grand debut. Scientists today point to a region in northwestern China where the outbreak likely began. But back then, no one knew a thing. If someone dropped dead, people just said, "Welp, the spirits are angry again." As trade routes like the Silk Road carried exotic spices, silk, and bad travel snacks, they also unknowingly transported a microbe that would soon turn Europe into a real-life horror show. Spoiler, the bacteria traveled faster than gossip in a medieval tavern. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. The Black Death had already packed its bags and was sailing westward, ready to ruin everyone's day. So yes, while the East gave the world gunpowder, noodles, and fireworks, it also unintentionally gave it a microbial monster with no respect for borders or hygiene. If you thought the Silk Road was all about fancy spices, shiny silk, and camels with attitude, think again. This ancient trade route, stretching from China to Europe, didn't just carry treasures. It also delivered one very unwanted guest, the plague. Like a sneaky hitchhiker, Yersinia pestis latched onto traders, stowaway fleas, and unlucky rodents, traveling thousands of miles across deserts, cities, and empires. Caravans that once brought perfumes and poetry now brought pestilence. Every pit stop, whether a crowded bazaar or a sleepy inn, became a new infection point. And let's be honest, medieval hand-washing techniques weren't exactly 5-star. Soldiers, pilgrims, merchants, they all became accidental ambassadors of doom. The disease didn't need a passport, just warm bodies and some rat legs. By the time the caravans reached the edges of the Byzantine and Islamic empires, the bacteria had already set up camp, throwing a continental party nobody wanted an invite to. Spoiler alert, it only gets worse from here. After hitching a ride across the Silk Road, the plague finally decided to make its European debut with flair. The year was 1347, and the lucky host of this gruesome premiere, the port city of Messina, Italy. Picture this. A fleet of Genoese trading ships rolls into harbor, and the locals rush down, expecting silk, spices, and exotic gossip. Instead, they get sailors coughing, dying, and covered in mysterious black boils. Surprise! These ships had just come from the east, carrying not only goods but also something far less welcome, death in bulk. The authorities, in a rare act of medieval logic, told the ships to get lost. But too late. The rats had already jumped ship, literally. The fleas had moved in, and the bacteria was now house hunting across Sicily. From that moment on, it was game over. The Black Death had officially arrived in Europe, uninvited, unapologetic, and absolutely relentless. So what did the Black Death actually look like? Imagine waking up one morning with a headache. By lunch, you're shivering, vomiting, and your neck feels like it's hiding golf balls. Welcome to the buboes, the signature move of this charming illness. These swollen lymph nodes, often in the groin, neck, or armpits, could grow to the size of eggs and turn a terrifying shade of black or purple. And just in case that wasn't dramatic enough, You might also start bleeding under your skin, creating dark patches like you were attacked by a very clumsy tattoo artist. Fever? Through the roof. Pain? Constant. Survival rate? Let's just say people didn't bother making long-term plans. Some died within 48 hours. Others lasted just long enough to spread it to everyone they loved. In short, if you had the plague, your calendar was about to clear itself, permanently. Let's talk about the real masterminds behind the Black Death: rats and fleas. Yep, while humans were busy blaming sins, witches, and astrology charts, the true villains were nibbling breadcrumbs under the table. First, the fleas, tiny, jumpy bloodsuckers with no sense of personal boundaries. They feasted on infected rats, then got bored and decided to hop onto humans for dessert. The rats, meanwhile, were just doing rat things, scurrying through alleys, stealing food, and unknowingly transporting death city to city. These furry little Uber drivers of doom didn't get sick themselves, but they sure made sure everyone else did. And since medieval cities were basically giant cheese wheels of filth, the rats had VIP access to every home, castle, and monastery. So while kings prayed and peasants panicked, the real biological warfare was happening underfoot, one flea bite at a time. With bodies piling up and no clue about bacteria, medieval folks did what they did best: blame everything but the real cause. Some said it was God's wrath for humanity's sins. Others blamed the alignment of planets, bad air, or even too much dancing on Sundays. Priests led parades of repentance, flagellants whipped themselves in public, and people lit candles like their lives depended on it, because they kind of did. No one suspected the rats under their floorboards or the fleas hiding in their socks. Instead, they turned to prayer, superstition, and the classic medieval solution to every problem: find a scapegoat and panic dramatically. Science? That was for heretics. The plague wasn't a germ. It was divine punishment wrapped in pus. Spoiler, the rats were probably laughing in the walls while watching humans blame Jupiter and sin instead of checking their hygiene. As the panic grew faster than the plague itself, people started looking for someone, anyone, to blame. And tragically, many pointed fingers at the Jewish communities. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells, cursed cities, or summoned disease with mysterious rituals. Logic? None. But fear doesn't need logic. It needs a scapegoat. Despite the fact that Jewish neighborhoods often had lower infection rates, thanks to religious hygiene laws, they were accused of causing the plague instead of, avoiding it. Across Europe, angry mobs stormed Jewish quarters, burned synagogues, and committed horrific massacres, all while the real killers, rats and fleas, remember them, scurried underfoot unnoticed. It was one of the darkest side effects of the Black Death, when people stopped thinking and started blaming the innocent. If the Grim Reaper had a fashion consultant, it was probably the medieval plague doctor. Picture this: long black robe, wide-brimmed hat, gloves, and the iconic beaked mask that looked like a cursed bird cosplay. But this wasn't just a style choice. Those masks were filled with herbs, spices, and sometimes vinegar-soaked cloth, all in the hope of filtering the bad air they believed caused the plague. Armed with a cane to poke at patients from a safe distance, of course, and a notebook to record death tolls, these doctors were both healers and harbingers. They rarely cured anyone, but they sure looked cool doing it, in a horrifying way. Their eerie appearance has become the lasting image of the Black Death. Part doctor, part death omen, and 100% nightmare fuel. Let's just say, if this guy walked into your town back then, you'd start digging your own grave, just to be proactive. Imagine a time when cemeteries had waiting lists and grave diggers were more in demand than royal chefs. Welcome to the grim world of mass burials during the Black Death. As bodies piled up faster than anyone could count, cities ran out of places and people to bury the dead. There weren't enough coffins, priests, or shovels. Entire families were tossed into deep pits, hastily dug outside city walls, often without last rites or even a name. The smell? Let's just say it was enough to make even the plague doctors reconsider their career choices. Horses dragged carts loaded with corpses through silent streets, followed only by buzzing flies and distant weeping. It was like a zombie movie, minus the reanimation. In some towns, death was so overwhelming that they started stacking the dead in layers, like a tragic lasagna of despair. If medieval Europe had had reality TV, this would have been the darkest episode of Extreme Burial Makeover. When a third of the population disappears, the economy doesn't just catch a cold, it face plants into a ditch and cries for its mama. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it slaughtered entire labor forces. Fields were left unharvested, markets deserted, and castles had to survive without servants. Gasp. Bread prices soared, not because of inflation theories, but because no one was left to bake it. Landowners scrambled to hire anyone still breathing, sometimes even throwing in livestock as signing bonuses. Serfs suddenly found themselves with bargaining power, and let's just say they milked it, literally. The plague flipped feudal society on its head, and for once, being a peasant wasn't the worst gig in town. In short, the Black Death wasn't just a health crisis, it was a job market reset button with rats. Silence, that's all you hear walking through what used to be a bustling medieval town. Streets once filled with shouting merchants and gossiping bakers are now deserted, save for the occasional caw of a raven and a suspiciously large rat waddling across the cobblestones. Once proud houses now stand with broken shutters and half-open doors, like mouths frozen in silent screams. The air smells of mildew, smoke, and something unsettling. Welcome to the ghost cities of the plague. No one left to ring the church bells. No children playing, just echoes. Even the stray dogs have moved on, probably disgusted. These weren't just abandoned places. They were snapshots of civilization hitting pause. Some towns were so empty that travelers thought they'd wandered into cursed lands. But no, it wasn't a curse. It was a bacteria with a flair for drama. And drama it delivered. Big time. In times of crisis, people usually turn to faith. But during the Black Death, the church, Europe's spiritual lifeguard, was too busy drowning. Priests either died, ran away, or locked themselves in monasteries with enough cheese to last the apocalypse. Masses were canceled, confessions unattended, and holy water ran dry. Because let's be honest, no one wanted to touch anyone else. As corpses piled up, prayers felt like shouting into the void. People began to question, if God's in charge, is he on vacation? The plague didn't just attack the body, it infected belief. Doubts spread faster than fleas. Some turned to superstition, others to self-punishment, and a few just said, well, guess we're all doomed, and threw a party. The once mighty church saw cracks forming in its foundation, not from earthquakes, but from the tremors of mass disappointment. Faith, like everything else in the 14th century, was getting seriously tested. When prayers didn't work and the priests were either dead or hiding, some people decided it was time to take matters and whips into their own hands. Enter the flagellants, roving bands of ultra-pious fanatics who believed the plague was punishment for humanity's sins. Their solution? March from town to town, chanting hymns and whipping themselves bloody in the streets. Imagine a medieval flash mob, but with less dancing and a lot more open wounds. They thought that by punishing themselves, they could save everyone else. Spoiler, it didn't work. But the spectacle was so intense, it drew crowds. Some cheered, some cried, some passed out. Meanwhile, city officials were like, cool story, but please don't bleed on the cobblestones. Eventually, the church banned them, but not before they left a gory impression on plague history. Proof that when things go wrong, humans are very creative at making things weirder. When death becomes your neighbor, people naturally turn to storytelling, and the Black Death gave rise to some of the darkest bedtime stories ever told. Folk tales, songs and legends spread faster than the plague itself. Enter the personification of death. Not just a shadowy figure, but a bony guy in a cloak, swinging a scythe and always late to parties because everyone's already dead. Children sang creepy nursery rhymes like Ring Around the Rosie. Cute melody, morbid meaning. There were tales of ghostly wagons collecting the dead, of towns haunted by black dogs, and of mysterious travelers who brought disease with a single touch. In the absence of Netflix, medieval Europeans got creative with horror. These stories weren't just for entertainment. They helped people make sense of chaos, even if the explanations included witches, omens, and skeletal party crashers. The plague didn't just kill people, it infected imaginations too. When the plague came knocking, the nobility didn't just pray, they packed their bags. Lords, ladies, and wealthy merchants fled the cities like rats from a sinking ship. Ironically, the rats stayed behind. They escaped to remote castles, countryside estates, or anywhere without coughing peasants. But here's the twist. They brought their servants, and sometimes the plague hitched a ride. So while the rich thought they were safe sipping wine and reading poetry in the hills, some died just as poetically, in bed with fever and a servant sneezing nearby. These upper-class escapees didn't exactly inspire sympathy. To the poor, it was like watching your boss run from a burning building with a sack of gold and yelling, "Good luck!" Meanwhile, the disease didn't care about your social status. It just needed a warm host. Morale of the story? Even velvet robes can't protect you from a microbe with an attitude. When death becomes part of daily life, artists start painting nightmares. During the Black Death, European painters ditched cheerful angels and noble saints and instead picked up their brushes to capture rotting bodies, dancing skeletons, and wide-eyed peasants running from invisible doom. Welcome to plague art. Churches, chapels, and even wealthy homes commissioned pieces like Danse Macabre, a joyful little mural of skeletons leading kings, bishops, and bakers to the grave, like it was prom night in hell. One day you're admiring a stained glass window. The next you're staring at a fresco of a guy vomiting blood. These paintings weren't just horror for horror's sake. They were moral warnings, spiritual lessons, and, let's be honest, a medieval way of saying YOLO. The line between life and death was thin, and painters made sure no one forgot it. If there was ever a renaissance of doom, this was it, with color palettes of black, brown, and pale corpse green. When the adults vanished or collapsed, someone had to pick up the pieces. Enter the orphan army. As the Black Death swept across Europe, it didn't discriminate. Parents, siblings, neighbors, gone. What was left behind? Thousands of children wandering the streets like tiny medieval zombies, covered in dirt and confusion. Some tried to survive by stealing bread. Others begged at the doors of monasteries, while a few ended up in the early versions of orphanages, basically sad stone buildings with more rats than caretakers. These kids grew up fast, really fast. Imagine being 8 and your job is try not to die before lunch. The older ones form packs, roaming from town to town, sometimes getting hired as messengers, farmhands, or just distractions. Cities tried to round them up, but it was like catching fog with a rake. If the plague didn't get you, starvation or exposure probably would. And yet, somehow, some of them survived. And they carried the trauma, the resilience, and the street smarts of a generation raised by chaos. As cities descended into plague-induced panic, some leaders decided it was time to get creative. Enter the medieval quarantine, a mix of bold strategy and total guesswork. Ports slammed shut, town gates were locked like your ex's Instagram profile, and anyone coughing too enthusiastically was suddenly everyone's enemy. Ships arriving at harbor were told to wait 40 days offshore. Thus, quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni was born. It was a revolutionary idea. Let's just wait and see who dies first. Cities also began posting guards at entry points, not to keep out invading armies, but to stop traveling merchants and their mysterious sniffles. Meanwhile, inside the towns, anyone with a hint of a fever was quickly relocated. Translation, tossed into an abandoned barn with other sick folks and a goat named Maurice. These early efforts, while chaotic and mostly ineffective, laid the groundwork for future public health policies. Because nothing says we care about safety quite like shutting the city gates and pretending no one's inside. When medieval panic reached its fever pitch, pun absolutely intended, cities scrambled for solutions, and thus the first field hospitals were born. Well, hospital might be a strong word. Picture this, a wooden barn, 2 monks with 0 medical training, a bucket of herbs, and a goat acting as emotional support. Patients were lined up side by side on straw mats, coughing in harmony like a tragic choir. No privacy, no anesthesia, and the only treatment was prayers, garlic necklaces, or getting bled with a rusty knife. But hey, at least they tried. These makeshift facilities popped up wherever the bodies piled high. Churches, warehouses, even abandoned inns. It was the medieval version of flattening the curve, by putting everyone sick in one place and hoping for the best. Yet despite the chaos, these early attempts showed a shift, from fear and superstition to slightly organized care. A disaster? Totally. But a historic milestone? Surprisingly, yes. In the midst of widespread chaos, some brave and possibly very bored scholars began writing down everything they observed. These medieval science bros documented symptoms like bulging buboes, uncontrollable fevers, and that lovely detail where people coughed until their lungs practically gave up. The texts ranged from semi-scientific scrolls to downright magical manuals. Some recommended rose water and vinegar, others insisted on planetary alignment as the real culprit. Still, these early attempts at medical record-keeping marked the humble and slightly misguided birth of epidemiology. Monks scribbled on parchment by candlelight, comparing notes. Did your guy also explode into boils? Oh, same here. These records would later help future doctors understand the plague better, assuming they could read the terrible handwriting. Despite lacking microscopes or germ theory, these pioneers laid the groundwork for tracking disease trends. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and way better than bleeding a patient than praying for a miracle. While most were dying or running, a few lucky or cursed survivors picked up a quill and decided, you know what? Let's write this madness down. These were monks, scribes, and curious souls who kept diaries during the Black Death. Some wrote about the smell, unbearable. Others documented seeing carts piled with corpses and priests too afraid to pray. One monk complained, the bells ring no longer for the dead because there's no one left to ring them. These journals, full of panic, grief, and morbid humor, give us a raw, human look at a world crumbling under plague. Forget dry statistics. These are emotional time capsules, filled with love letters never delivered and grocery lists that stopped halfway. Thanks to these writers, we now understand how it truly felt to live during one of history's darkest chapters, and maybe feel slightly better about our own bad days. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, introducing ghost ships. During the plague, some merchant vessels left port with healthy crews, but arrived weeks later with nothing but rats, corpses, and an overwhelming smell of doom. Entire crews were wiped out mid-journey, leaving ships to drift aimlessly toward unsuspecting harbors. Imagine being a dock worker in 1348, spotting a ship gently floating in, only to find everyone on board stone-cold dead. These ships spread terror, disease, and enough nightmares to last a lifetime. Coastal towns panicked, often setting the ships on fire without even checking for survivors. And yet, stories of cursed ships drifting into foggy harbors became legendary. Medieval horror stories before horror was even a genre. So if you think cruise ships today are bad, at least they come with room service and a living captain. If the plague were a rock concert, Florence and Paris were the front row seats. Chaos, screaming, and no encore. Florence, once the jewel of the Renaissance, turned into a ghost town faster than you can say plague pit. People collapsed in the streets, artists stopped painting, and bakeries ran out of bread. Truly the final straw. Meanwhile, Paris was no picnic either. The city of light dimmed as sickness swept through narrow alleys, and even the nobles weren't spared. The rich tried to flee, but rats had better mobility. Hospitals were overwhelmed, cemeteries ran out of room, and the smell, let's just say medieval perfume sales hit an all-time high. These cities, centers of culture and learning, suddenly became case studies in how not to handle a pandemic. And yet somehow, out of this chaos would emerge new ideas, bolder art, and slightly more obsessive hand-washing habits. When fear takes over, compassion takes a vacation. During the peak of the Black Death, social bonds unraveled faster than a cheap medieval tunic. Neighbors bolted their doors, families abandoned the sick, and even the most devout forgot the phrase, "Love thy neighbor." If your spouse started coughing, some didn't call the doctor. They called a locksmith. Entire homes were left to rot with both the living and the dead inside. Food deliveries? Forget it. The DoorDash of 1348 was tossing stale bread through windows and hoping you didn't catch the plague in return. Trust, love, and basic human decency took a backseat to survival. It wasn't just a public health crisis. It was a moral breakdown, where self-preservation turned everyone into solo players in the world's worst apocalypse game. If you thought being rich in the Middle Ages could save you, think again. The plague didn't care if you had silk sheets or a moat with swans. It still knocked on your castle door. Nobles locked themselves inside their stone fortresses, hoping thick walls would stop invisible bacteria. Spoiler, they didn't. Servants fell sick first, then the cooks, then the family dog, and eventually the Duke himself started coughing during dinner. Panic turned palaces into prisons. Some noble families vanished entirely, their titles and fortunes buried with them. Even kings weren't immune. After all, Yersinia pestis doesn't bow to crowns. The Black Death was the ultimate equalizer, stripping away status and reminding everyone. Whether you're in rags or robes, the Grim Reaper doesn't play favorites. With so many people dropping like flies, the government had one job: keep things in order. Guess what? It didn't. Local officials either died, ran away, or locked themselves in cellars with barrels of wine and a "do not disturb" sign. Courts stopped functioning, taxes stopped being collected, silver lining, and city gates creaked open with no guards left to guard them. Criminals had a field day, if there was anyone left to rob, that is. Law enforcement turned into folklore. Once upon a time, there were rules. From kings to mayors, no one had a plan. Bureaucracy crumbled faster than a week-old baguette. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the idea that someone, somewhere was still in charge. The numbers were staggering. In just a few short years, Europe lost nearly a third of its population. Entire villages vanished. No smoke from chimneys, no footsteps on muddy roads, just eerie silence and broken doors swinging in the wind. Graveyards ran out of space and the living ran out of tears. People stopped counting the dead because the dead outnumbered the living. Imagine your neighborhood, your town, your entire country, 1 out of every 3 people simply gone. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was the unraveling of society. Farms were abandoned, churches empty, and schools silent. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it left a gaping hole in the heart of Europe, one that took centuries to mend. And in that hole grew fear, desperation, and eventually, change. Just when people thought the nightmare was over, the plague pulled a comeback no one asked for. It didn't vanish into the history books. It lurked, simmering in the shadows, and returned again and again like a horror sequel nobody wanted. Every few decades, it popped up like an uninvited guest at a family reunion, and each time, it brought the same old party favors: swollen lymph nodes, high fever, and mass panic. Some towns were hit so many times, they lost count and hope. No one could ever truly relax. Ah, peace at last. Q Plague Remix Edition. Whether it was the bubonic, pneumonic, or septicemic variety, the Black Death made sure medieval Europe never really got a break. You could survive one wave and still get surprise slapped by the next. So much for moving on. The Black Death didn't just leave behind graves and ghost towns. It planted the seeds of change. With so many gone, survivors had to rethink everything: medicine, labor, society, even faith. Suddenly, doctors started washing hands. Shocking, we know. Quarantines became a thing, and peasants realized they could ask for better wages. After all, half the workforce was missing. Some historians say the plague helped end feudalism and gave birth to the modern world. Universities rewrote medical books. Artists painted not just angels, but skeletons too, and churches. Well, they had some explaining to do. The horror was real, but so was the transformation. From ashes rose ideas, resistance, and reform. The Black Death wasn't just a catastrophe. It was a terrible, smelly, rat-powered catalyst for a new Europe. If the Black Death was a rampaging dragon, leprosy was more like a slow, silent curse. In medieval times, leprosy wasn't just a disease. It was a life sentence of exile, shame, and loneliness. People believed it was divine punishment, a physical sign of sin, and no one wanted to get near a sinner. Those afflicted were forced to live in leper colonies, wear warning bells, and undergo a living funeral to be officially declared socially dead. Imagine being kicked out of town with a bell around your neck and a sign saying unclean. Not exactly a warm goodbye. Yet the fear was real and the ignorance even more powerful. As we start this chapter on leprosy, buckle up for a tale not of sudden death, but of slow disappearance. One scratch, one sore, one heartbreak at a time. Oh, and don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Unlike medieval folks, we actually listen to the outcasts here. Before it became the infamous medieval boogeyman, leprosy had been lurking in human history for thousands of years. Ancient records from India, China, and Egypt describe symptoms eerily similar to the disease. But in the Middle Ages, it got a serious PR upgrade. From just another illness to heaven-sent punishment. With no microscopes and way too much imagination, people believed leprosy was caused by sin, demons, or maybe a bad horoscope. Once it arrived in Europe through trade routes and returning crusaders, it spread slowly but stuck like gossip at a royal banquet. Unlike the fast-kill drama of the plague, leprosy took its time, disfiguring and isolating its victims for decades. By the 12th century, it had gone viral, in the worst possible way. So yes, while leprosy may not have killed you in a week, it did something worse. Made you live, while everyone else pretended you were already dead. Leprosy wasn't the kind of disease that shouted, it whispered. It started with tiny numb patches on the skin. Easy to ignore, like that cousin who only texts when they need money. Then came the sores, then the loss of feeling, and then parts of your body quietly stopped being yours. Fingers curled into claws, noses collapsed, and faces melted into tragic masks. If that wasn't enough, there were the sudden injuries. Because when you can't feel pain, you don't notice the fire you're cooking over until your hand is half barbecue. Even worse, these symptoms took years to fully bloom, so people had plenty of time to stare, whisper, and make up wildly incorrect medical theories. It wasn't contagious like the plague, but it was much more terrifying socially, because it didn't just take your health, it took your identity, one disfigured day at a time. In the Middle Ages, if you caught leprosy, people didn't just think you were sick. They thought God personally unfriended you. Leprosy wasn't seen as a medical issue, but as a spiritual punishment, the divine equivalent of being put on eternal mute. It didn't help that biblical texts mentioned lepers, so naturally people assumed the disease was linked to sin, demons, or forgetting to say grace before meals. Priests preached that sufferers were paying for their wickedness, even if the most wicked thing they'd done was steal an extra onion from the stew. The result? Lepers weren't just feared, they were condemned. Villagers avoided them like cursed talismans, and family members wept not just for their health, but for their supposedly doomed souls. It wasn't enough to be disfigured. You also got labeled a walking divine warning sign. And heaven forbid you sneeze in public. It could be interpreted as both a symptom and a confession. If you had leprosy in medieval times, congratulations. You just got voted off the island of society. Literally. People with leprosy were treated as if they had already died. Families held symbolic funerals, complete with weeping relatives and a priest waving goodbye like you were boarding a one-way ship to Nowheresville. You weren't just sick, you were socially deceased. Your name? Forgotten. Your rights? Revoked. Your place at the dinner table? Reassigned to the dog. Even if you waved enthusiastically from a distance, townsfolk would clutch their children and dive into the nearest ditch. Being exiled meant a lonely hut outside the village. No hugs and lots of echo when you said hello. The medieval motto seemed to be, out of sight, out of soul. Harsh? Absolutely. But hey, at least you didn't have to attend your own funeral. Oh, wait, you kind of did. Medieval lawmakers weren't big fans of subtlety. If you had leprosy, there were clear rules. Thou shalt not touch, approach, sneeze near, or even cast a shadow on healthy folks. Violators? Punished like they just tried to overthrow the king. Laws were inked into town records, declaring lepers must carry a bell, stay away from public fountains, and never under any circumstance go shopping. Some towns even assigned leper police, whose job was basically yelling, "Hey, 6 feet back." 8 centuries before social distancing was trendy. And if you were caught breaking these laws, fines, lashings, or worse, exile from exile. It was like being grounded, but you're already banished. These laws, though hilariously strict, reveal the level of fear and ignorance surrounding leprosy. The disease was bad, but society's paranoia, much worse. If you thought medieval Airbnbs were rough, wait until you visit a leper colony. These exclusive settlements were strategically placed far away from civilization, on hills, islands, or anywhere nobody wanted to accidentally bump elbows with a leper. Life there wasn't exactly 5-star. No heating, no clean water, and certainly no room service. People built makeshift huts out of mud, sticks, and leftover shame. Food? Delivered occasionally by brave souls who tossed loaves like they were feeding crocodiles. Social life? Limited to playing chess with someone whose fingers might literally fall off mid-game. These colonies were more like open-air prisons than healing sanctuaries, and yet somehow a strange sense of community still blossomed. Misery, after all, loves company, especially if company also jingles while walking. Forget ninja stealth. Medieval lepers were required to jingle like walking wind chimes. The infamous leper bell, worn around the neck or held in hand, was meant to alert everyone nearby. Infected human incoming. The bell's sound wasn't exactly subtle either. You could hear it from a block away, like a cow lost in a church choir. For the lepers, it meant constant humiliation. For everyone else, it was the medieval version of a public service announcement. The poor souls had to ring it while walking, standing, even sneezing. Some tried to muffle the sound with cloth, only to be fined or even beaten for breaking the law. It was less about health and more about keeping fear alive. And so through alleys, fields, and marketplaces, at a safe distance, the bell tolled, not for the dead, but for the living who had already been buried socially. As if being sick wasn't bad enough, medieval lepers had to attend their own funeral, while still alive. Yes, you heard right. The infamous living funeral was a real ritual. A priest would bless the afflicted as if they had already passed, sprinkle holy water on them, and even throw a bit of dirt on their feet just to drive the point home. They'd lie in a grave or coffin, symbolically dead to the world. After the ritual, they were officially cut off from society. No inheritance, no legal rights, no birthday invites. They were basically ghosts with bills to pay. This was society's dramatic way of saying, "You're still breathing, but we'd prefer you didn't." And so, draped in funeral garb, the leper would leave the churchyard not to rest in peace, but to live in isolation, mourned by none, feared by all. While medieval adults feared leprosy like the plague, children paid an even crueler price. Imagine being 6 years old and suddenly labeled tainted because your parents caught the disease. Overnight, some children were abandoned, left crying outside village gates, with only a crust of bread and the family dog who didn't get the memo. Others were forced to live in leper colonies, even if they were completely healthy. Why? Because guilt by association was the trend of the century. These kids grew up not knowing the warmth of a hug from a neighbor, the chaos of a market, or the joy of a school prank. Just the silence of isolation and the smell of soup no one wants to eat. And if that wasn't tragic enough, many of them believed they were cursed because society said so. So next time your parents embarrass you online, remember, at least they didn't leave you at the plague gates with a note pinned to your tunic. In the Middle Ages, love didn't just face the classic obstacles of overbearing parents or bad poetry. It had to fight off leprosy too. Imagine Romeo and Juliet, but Juliet gets exiled to a leper colony, and Romeo isn't allowed within a trumpet blast distance. Countless love stories were cut short, not because of broken hearts, but because of broken immune systems. Letters were banned, visits were punished, and shared memories were replaced with rumors and guilt. One famous tale tells of a young couple who tried to meet by sneaking around the edge of the forest, only to be caught and condemned, her to the colony, him to a lifetime of regret. Love may conquer all, but leprosy sure made it file a lot more paperwork. And in medieval society, until death do us part, sometimes meant until your skin starts to fall off, then bye. Imagine being banished from society and still expected to build your own home with numb fingers and rotting toes. Welcome to the DIY nightmare of leprosy patients in the Middle Ages. These folks didn't just lose their social standing, they lost access to basic shelter. So with zero architectural training and plenty of painful determination, they grabbed whatever sticks, stones, or discarded cloaks they could find to make homes that barely passed as huts. These structures looked like a squirrel tried to build a castle with its eyes closed. Some begged for food, others traded what little they had, but most relied on the rare kindness of strangers. Their lives were a mix of sad construction projects and even sadder dinner menus. But hey, when society throws you out, at least you get a shack with a nice view of the goat pasture. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear itchy robes and carry crosses into places no one else dares enter. In the heart of leper colonies, a few brave monks and priests stepped in, armed not with medicine but with compassion and maybe a bit of holy water, just in case. While most folks sprinted away at the sound of leper bells, these spiritual daredevils walked right in, offering sermons, prayers, and sometimes just a hand to hold, preferably a non-infected one. They didn't heal bodies, but they soothed souls, turning abandoned huts into havens of faith. Sure, some were terrified but believed it was their divine calling. And in a world where even family fled, a whisper of kindness from a friar was a miracle in itself. Move over, knights in shining armor. The real MVPs wore sandals and smelled like incense. Medieval doctors versus leprosy? Let's just say it wasn't exactly a fair fight. With no understanding of bacteria and zero clue about contagious diseases, physicians back then were basically swinging in the dark, sometimes literally with candles. Diagnoses were creative. Some blamed bad air, others evil spirits, or even an imbalance in the four humors. Yes, that ancient body juice theory again. Treatments? Forget antibiotics. Leeching, bloodletting, chanting prayers, and burning herbs like you were trying to chase away ghosts at a haunted house. At best, patients smelled like incense. At worst, they lost another toe. The real medical advice? Don't get sick. But if you did, well, may the saints have mercy, because the doctors sure couldn't help you. Desperate times called for even more desperate measures. Medieval doctors, after failing to cure leprosy with prayers and potions, turned to experimental methods that range from weird to downright terrifying. Some recommended rubbing ash into the skin, because nothing says healing like being a walking fireplace. Others tried scraping the skin off to let the disease out, a brilliant way to ensure more infections. Herbal compresses, animal fat mixtures, even frog slime were all part of the medieval cure starter pack. Of course, none of it worked. But hey, at least the patient felt something, usually pain, followed by screaming, and then more pain. Welcome to the golden age of trial and error medicine, where science was optional, but drama was guaranteed. Imagine being banned from church, the market, and even the village well, just because your nose looks suspiciously lopsided. Welcome to medieval leprosy, where being infected was like wearing an invisibility cloak, except everyone still saw you and ran. Leprosy patients were treated like haunted furniture, left outside, avoided, and never invited in. Entering any public space was forbidden, unless you fancied being beaten with sticks or escorted out by very nervous monks. And if someone accidentally touched you, that was grounds for social exorcism. It's like medieval society said, "You shall not pass," and meant it, literally. Being a ghost would have been more social. Even kings couldn't escape the wrath of leprosy, or the court gossip that came with it. One famous tale tells of a monarch who, despite his royal robes and glittering crown, began to develop suspicious skin spots and a nose that looked like it was taking a vacation. Whispers filled the court. Is it the plague, witchcraft, or just bad hygiene? Eventually, the poor king was exiled from his own castle, not with pitchforks, but polite awkwardness and a strong suggestion to retire early. Turns out, blue blood doesn't make you immune to medieval paranoia. In the kingdom of leprosy, everyone was equal, equally avoided. Not all medieval minds were soaked in superstition and garlic potions. Amidst the widespread fear and finger-pointing, a few religious orders decided to do something radical: kindness. Some monasteries and nunneries established leper hospitals, calm havens where the sick were treated like, well, actual people. No holy water exorcisms, no bells to shame them. Just a warm bed, some soup, and a prayer that didn't involve fire and brimstone. These places weren't luxurious, think hay mattresses and questionable stew, but compared to the outside world, they were five-star sanctuaries. It turns out that amidst the gloom of ignorance, a few candles of compassion still flickered. If medieval art galleries had a most misunderstood subject award, people with leprosy would win it hands down. Paintings and sculptures from the era didn't hold back. They portrayed lepers as horned demons, zombies with melting faces, or cursed souls wrapped in rags, always lurking in the shadows. It's as if the artists were in a contest to see who could draw the most terrifying version of someone with a skin disease. These artworks, displayed in churches and public squares, were less about raising awareness and more about spreading fear. Poor lepers, suffering in real life and still getting roasted in the stone and canvas. In the Middle Ages, when medicine was mostly guesswork and prayers were plan A, B, and C, many believed that Saint Lazarus could cure leprosy. Why Lazarus? Well, he was raised from the dead, so curing a nasty skin disease must have seemed like light work. Lepers across Europe clutched little figurines, wore medallions, and mumbled prayers like magical chants, hoping Lazarus would notice them from heaven. Some even walked for weeks to visit churches dedicated to him, because why not add sore feet to the list of symptoms? Whether miracle or myth, Saint Lazarus became the unofficial patron saint of the hopelessly itchy. As if life with leprosy wasn't grim enough, even death didn't promise peace. In some medieval regions, laws forbade lepers from being buried alongside healthy people, because apparently even corpses had social status. Special cemeteries were designated far from towns, often on cursed-looking hills with howling winds, because why not haunt the lepers twice? These burial grounds were sometimes unmarked, as if erasing their names could erase the disease. The fear of posthumous contagion ran so deep, some even buried lepers with stones over their chests, just in case they got any afterlife ideas. Medieval logic, harsh but consistently dramatic. Every prison has its jailbreak, and even the leper colonies of the Middle Ages weren't immune to a little rebellious spirit. Occasionally, a patient, tired of eating boiled turnips and hearing nothing but church bells, would make a grand escape. The result, widespread panic. Villagers screamed, church bells rang again, and hastily armed search parties formed to recapture the fleeing leper as if they were hunting a dragon. Posters weren't needed, just shouts like, "The cursed one has fled." These escapees weren't aiming for freedom, just one last glimpse of normal life. But in the eyes of society, they might as well have been carrying the apocalypse in a sack. Hidden under a pile of old cloth and half-rotten bread, a small leather-bound diary was discovered in the ruins of a medieval leper colony. Its fragile pages, filled with shaky handwriting, told the heartbreaking yet oddly humorous account of a man named Tomas. Once a baker with dreams of opening a second oven, Tomas now chronicled his days counting beetles, naming goats, and hosting imaginary tea parties. His writing bounced between sorrow and sarcasm. One line reading, "My left ear fell off today. On the bright side, fewer places to hang lice." Tomas's diary became a rare window into the soul of those forgotten. Not saints, not martyrs, just human beings clinging to dignity with ink and wit. While medieval Europe was busy ringing bells and banning lepers from churches, A few wise men in the Arab world were scratching their beards and saying, "Wait a minute, maybe it's not a curse from demons." In places like Baghdad and Cordoba, physicians were actually studying diseases, not just praying them away. These early medical thinkers began observing symptoms, noting how the disease spread, and, most shockingly, not blaming it on a sinful lifestyle or goat demons. They even experimented with herbal treatments, isolation strategies, and documentation. It wasn't a magical cure, but it was science, centuries ahead of the West. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Thomas, remember him, was still naming his beetles. If science was slow to explain leprosy, folklore wasted no time pointing fingers, straight at demons, witches, or that one grumpy old neighbor who always talked to cats. Many people believed that leprosy was the result of a curse, a punishment from evil spirits, or worse, an inherited sin passed down through generations. Village elders would whisper about haunted forests, cursed wells, and mysterious shadows that gave people the rot. Some even claimed the disease came from making eye contact with a goat at midnight. Yes, really. Instead of doctors, people turned to shamans, exorcists, or the guy who sold garlic and good vibes. And somehow, blaming ghosts was less stressful than understanding germs. Born into the world with no symptoms, no lesions, and absolutely no idea what's going on, children in leper colonies had the worst lottery prize ever. Despite being healthy, they were treated like ticking time bombs wrapped in tiny tunics. Locals feared even their breath could spread the disease, and so these kids were barred from schools, temples, and playgrounds. Not that medieval swings were fun anyway. They inherited exile without earning it, just because mom or dad had a bit of bad luck and maybe a suspicious nose. Growing up in a world where the only bedtime story was the day the baker ran away screaming wasn't ideal. Worse, even if these kids grew up strong and healthy, society still gave them the stink eye, because nothing says innocent like a lifetime of unfair judgment. In the leper colonies, hope was a rare guest, but it still knocked on the door occasionally, usually in the form of one last wish, to see family again. Patients would gather by the edge of the fence, peering out as if the road might suddenly deliver a loved one. Some waited every Sunday, dressed in their cleanest rags, hoping for a miracle in the form of a familiar face. And sometimes, just sometimes, a brave relative showed up, standing across the quarantine line, too scared to come closer but too loving to stay away. There were tears, waves, and shouts over the distance, turning every reunion into a dramatic medieval soap opera. No hugs, no handshakes, just aching stares and hearts doing all the talking. For many, that brief glance was enough to carry them through months, maybe years of solitude. Over time, some leper colonies stopped waiting for miracles and started planting vegetables. When life gives you leprosy, grow carrots, right? With nowhere to go and no one daring to come near, the patients slowly turned their isolated camps into tiny, self-sufficient villages. Chickens clucked, goats bleated, and gardens sprouted beside shacks made of anything remotely solid. A man with missing fingers would teach a one-eyed friend to fish, while a woman with a bandaged face milked a goat with impressive efficiency. It was tragic, yes, but also oddly inspiring. Despite illness, deformity, and social banishment, these forgotten souls cultivated resilience. In the face of doom, they didn't just survive, they grew onions. And sometimes those onions were the highlight of the entire month. Long after the last bell stopped ringing and the goats wandered off, remnants of medieval leper colonies still whisper their stories across Europe. From overgrown ruins in the French countryside to eerie stone walls on British hillsides, these places are time capsules of prejudice. Moss-covered gravestones, half-collapsed huts, and chapel remnants stand like the skeletons of a forgotten society. Tourists wander through them now, clueless, snapping selfies next to what used to be a plague fence. But for those who listen closely, the wind still carries the silent echo of cowbells, footsteps that avoided them, and prayers whispered from isolation. These ruins aren't just rocks. They're monuments to a world that chose fear over compassion. And somehow, centuries later, they still make us reflect. How much have we really changed? Leprosy may have lost its bite thanks to modern medicine, but the ghost of stigma still haunts us like a cowbell in the wind. Today, the disease is curable with antibiotics, and leper colonies are long gone, replaced by hospitals and support networks. But the centuries of fear, isolation, and shame left scars deeper than any skin lesion. Even now, patients in some regions face whispers, judgmental looks, or outright exclusion. The legacy of medieval superstition continues to echo in attitudes toward other illnesses too, from HIV to mental health. So while the bells have stopped ringing, maybe it's time we ring in something new: compassion without conditions. Because the true cure isn't just a pill, it's empathy. And that's something no medieval doctor ever prescribed. Welcome to Chapter 3, where we dive into a disease that didn't just ruin your weekend, it left lifelong scars on your face and your soul. Yes, we're talking about smallpox, the ultimate skin-deep horror story, with its signature blend of fever, misery, and pustules that made you look like a walking loaf of burnt bread. Smallpox turned medieval towns into horror movie sets. In this chapter, we'll explore the roots of the disease, its gruesome symptoms, and the panic it caused across Europe. But first, let's give a round of applause, or a cautious, hand-sanitized clap, to all the viewers still here with us. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this medieval madness with your friends, because nothing says I care about you like an educational tale about boils and pandemics. Let's get pockmarked. Before smallpox became a medieval horror story, it was already touring the ancient world like an unwanted rock band. Originating in ancient Eastern civilizations, possibly as early as the Egyptian or Indian empires, the virus hitched rides on caravans, merchant ships, and the occasional overly friendly diplomat. Thanks to the expanding trade routes, Silk Road, spice routes, and every buy 3 camels get 1 free promotion, the disease slowly crept westward. By the time it arrived in Europe, it was already a seasoned performer, bringing pustules and panic in equal measure. People in medieval Europe had barely recovered from the last plague when smallpox knocked on the door like, "Hey, remember me?" And because no one could swipe left on epidemics, it settled in and made itself at home. This was globalization before the internet, except instead of memes and cat videos, you got fevers and permanent facial souvenirs. Imagine waking up one morning with a headache, some fever, and a few red spots. You think, maybe it's just a heat rash or bad wine. Fast forward 48 hours, and you're a walking horror painting. Smallpox didn't hold back. The symptoms hit like a medieval drummer with no volume control. First came the high fever, pounding headaches, and muscle pain. Then your skin decided to join the rebellion with itchy red bumps that turned into fluid-filled blisters, which then crusted into scabs. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, pus. Lots of it. These lovely decorations covered your entire body, from scalp to toes, even inside your mouth and throat. Breathing, eating, laughing, forget it. By the time you looked into a mirror, if you dared, you barely recognized the lumpy, oozing person staring back. Smallpox didn't just attack, it turned your body into a bumpy battlefield with no mercy. If you thought the symptoms were terrifying, wait until you hear about the death toll. Smallpox wasn't just a bad day, it was a medieval death lottery, and everyone had a ticket. The fatality rate was shockingly high, especially among the most vulnerable, children and the elderly. Entire villages lost half their population in a matter of weeks. In households with multiple children, it wasn't unusual for parents to end up with 1 survivor and 5 funerals. For older folks, the disease was like an unsolicited retirement plan, one that ended in a pine box. Families would desperately isolate sick members, but by the time the first blister appeared, it was usually too late. Even doctors, well, medieval guessers in robes, were overwhelmed and clueless. The fear was so great that some townspeople buried victims before they were completely dead, just to be sure. And if that doesn't make you want to appreciate vaccines, I don't know what will. If you thought being royal gave you immunity, think again. Smallpox didn't care about crowns, castles, or family crests. It barged into royal palaces with all the subtlety of a drunken jester. Across Europe, kings, queens, and their heirs were falling like peasants in a tavern brawl. In fact, being royal might have been worse. Everyone expected you to survive with grace while your skin looked like overcooked porridge. Portraits of once handsome princes now showed a constellation of scars. Queen Mary II of England, gone. Tsar Peter II of Russia, also gone. Monarchs had golden thrones but no golden cure. And just like that, coronations were suddenly interrupted by cremations. Court physicians tried everything from prayers to potions made of ground pearls. Yes, royal remedies were just expensive nonsense. The lesson? Smallpox was the one equalizer in a very unequal world. It treated everyone like commoners, with extreme prejudice. If smallpox had a favorite target, it was children, and it wasn't subtle about it. Youngsters barely old enough to pronounce pox were the first to show symptoms, feverish, weak, and soon covered in angry red blisters. Parents watched in helpless horror as their kids writhed in pain, lost fluids faster than a tipped wine goblet, and slipped into seizures. Doctors, mostly useless. Treatments ranged from wrapping them in wet cloths to reciting long prayers while hoping for a miracle. Some kids made it through, scarred but alive. Most didn't. The disease didn't even wait for them to grow up. It struck at bedtime and sometimes finished its work before dawn. And because kids often shared beds, toys, and curious fingers, the disease spread like wildfire in a hay barn. Smallpox turned what should have been the most innocent phase of life into a terrifying lottery of survival, where the prize was usually a lifetime of scars or silence. Surviving smallpox was like winning a grim lottery. You lived, sure, but the prize was a face full of scars. Survivors bore the permanent autograph of the disease, deep cratered pockmarks that looked like someone had mistaken their cheeks for a battlefield. In medieval times, having such scars was a double-edged sword. On one hand, you were admired for your strength. On the other hand, your Tinder profile would have gotten 0 swipes if Tinder had existed. Children teased each other with nicknames like Moonface or Crater Carl, while adults covered their faces with veils, scarves, or medieval makeup thick enough to qualify as plaster. And just when you thought things couldn't get worse, some people believed scars made you spiritually impure, as if the physical trauma wasn't enough. In a society obsessed with appearances, yes, even back then, smallpox didn't just attack the body, it attacked dignity. And the worst part, those scars weren't badges of honor. They were just a reminder that you had danced with death and walked away with a face full of footprints. In the medieval world, medical treatment for smallpox was a bit like rolling the dice, only with more herbs, fire, and confusion. Doctors, or rather well-meaning guessers in robes, recommended everything from drinking ashes of burned frogs, yes, frogs, to smearing clay on the patient's body like a spa day designed by a sadist. Some tried wrapping the sick in wool soaked with vinegar. Others preferred hot pokers near the feet to draw out the fever, a method that cured nothing but your patience. Bloodletting was also popular. You're covered in pustules. Clearly your problem is too much blood. The most desperate even rubbed pigeon droppings on the sores, believing it had healing powers. No one was quite sure how any of this helped. But hey, if your patient stopped screaming, it was considered progress. These medieval cures were less about science and more about hoping the disease got bored and left. Spoiler, it usually didn't. When smallpox struck, medieval quarantine was simple. Lock the patient in a room, shut the door, and hope the plague got bored. This sealed room policy was the health authorities' best idea. If you had pustules, congratulations. You just won an all-inclusive stay in your own personal dungeon. Family members would slide food under the door with a long stick, yell encouragement from 10 meters away, and then sprint in the opposite direction if you coughed. The patient's main companions were a jug of water, some straw, and their own thoughts, usually along the lines of, "Why me?" It didn't matter if you were a baker or a baron. Once you got the spots, you got the isolation. In theory, it was to prevent spreading. In reality, it just ensured you suffered alone. And if you somehow got better, stepping outside was like being a ghost returning from exile. People gasped, crossed themselves, or tossed holy water just to be safe. When science failed or didn't exist yet, superstition took over with flair. Many believed smallpox wasn't a disease. It was a full-blown possession. You weren't sick. You were hosting a demon with terrible interior decorating skills. The cure? Not medicine, but amulets, chants, and the occasional chicken sacrifice. No, really. Medieval priests would stand outside the patient's room, waving incense and yelling Latin phrases, while villagers clutched garlic like it was holy armor. Some families even tied bells to the sick to scare off evil spirits, because if loud jingles worked on bears, surely it would work on Satan too. Others wrapped the patient in red cloth, believed to distract demons, or at least confuse them. In the end, faith was their strongest medicine, even if it came with side effects like smoke inhalation and plucked chickens. While ineffective, these rituals offered comfort. Because in a world where pustules bloomed like wildflowers and science hadn't shown up yet, waving a crucifix and whispering prayers was at least doing something. While much of medieval Europe was still diagnosing smallpox as demonic rash syndrome, Islamic medicine was surprisingly ahead of the game. Scholars like Al-Razi, aka Razis, were busy actually studying symptoms instead of burning chickens over incense. Al-Razi not only distinguished smallpox from measles, a plot twist no one expected back then, but also described its stages in great detail. He wrote about fever, the infamous pustules, and even recognized that survivors often carried lifelong scars. His works traveled across the Islamic world, offering physicians a more systematic understanding while everyone else was still rubbing garlic on their eyebrows. Hospitals in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba weren't just places to cry and pray. They actually kept medical records, observed quarantine practices, and tried not to mix patients like they were soup ingredients. While not perfect, this approach marked an early attempt at scientific thinking. So while some were chanting to banish demons, others were quietly writing textbooks. And guess which method worked better in the long run? While medieval Islamic physicians were meticulously documenting symptoms, back in Europe, some local healers had their own organic methods, which mostly involved random herbs, hopeful chants, and a generous sprinkle of wishful thinking. The village apothecary might mix crushed rosemary with goat spit, claiming it would calm the inner fire. Others brewed potions with nettle, sage, or moldy bread, which in hindsight was either a lucky accident or a biological experiment gone rogue. People rubbed onion paste on blisters, inhaled vinegar fumes, and even wrapped themselves in damp moss, because someone's cousin's neighbor's uncle once survived a cold using moss. The problem? Smallpox didn't care. It raged on like a house party you weren't invited to, but still had to clean up after. Despite the valiant efforts of herbalists, the disease spread like gossip in a bored village. Some treatments did have mild effects, probably from hydration or sheer placebo, but overall, it was like trying to stop a forest fire with a wet sponge. Still, the desperate creativity showed just how much people feared the disease, and how far they'd go to avoid it, even if it meant drinking boiled dandelions 3 times a day. When smallpox hit medieval towns like an uninvited guest with terrible manners, funerals became less about mourning and more about logistics. With bodies piling up faster than a tavern fills on free ale night, ceremonies were replaced by mass burials done in a hurry. Forget flowers, eulogies, or tearful goodbyes. There wasn't even time to find a clean shovel. Grave diggers worked overtime, often without knowing whose body they were burying. Sometimes they just wrap victims in a sheet, toss them into a pit, mutter something vaguely respectful, and move on to the next. The local priest? Probably too busy avoiding the sick to say a proper prayer. Coffins? Luxury item. Families? Often in quarantine or too scared to come close. It was grim, chaotic, and smelled like regret and garlic. But if there was one silver lining, okay, maybe a grayish one, it's that these rushed burials eventually inspired towns to build actual cemeteries, with fences and everything. Until then, though, if you heard someone digging at night, it wasn't a ghost story. It was just another hurried goodbye in the age of smallpox. As smallpox continued its rampage, it wasn't just skin that blistered. It was society's collective sanity. In medieval towns, if someone so much as sneezed, They were instantly viewed like a ticking time bomb. A casual cough could clear a room faster than a fire alarm. Markets became ghost towns, taverns went silent, and even gossiping neighbors kept their distance. An actual miracle. People avoided eye contact, held their breath in crowds, and washed hands with vinegar like it was holy water. Rumors spread faster than the disease itself. My cousin's neighbor's baker's apprentice looked pale yesterday. Run! Suspicion turned everyone into amateur plague detectives, armed with side eyes and garlic necklaces. Children were told not to play with the sniffling boy, and if your forehead felt a little warm, congratulations, you were now the village pariah. The fear was so thick, even pigeons felt judged. This wasn't just a pandemic, it was a full-blown paranoia party with no snacks. In the end, it wasn't only smallpox that scarred people. It was the looks, the whispers, and the unbearable silence of being treated like a walking curse. If you think medieval art was just angels and knights, think again. During the smallpox outbreaks, artists turned their attention to pustules. Yes, nothing says artistic inspiration like someone covered head to toe in angry red blisters. These illustrations were equal parts medical documentation and horror movie storyboard. The detail was absurdly vivid. Faces like cratered moons, bodies that looked like bubbling pizza, and eyes full of existential dread. You could almost hear the artist whispering, "Hold still while I sketch your most miserable moment." And surprisingly, the sufferers agreed, because if you're going to be a walking horror story, you might as well be immortalized in ink. These drawings were circulated as warnings, teaching tools, and unfortunately, occasional wall decorations in overenthusiastic apothecaries. Some even became collector's items for the morbidly curious crowd. Who needs flowers and landscapes when you can have a man oozing from 247 pustules? In short, medieval smallpox art wasn't just grotesque. It was the original medical meme, complete with bad proportions, dramatic poses, and the subtle message, "Don't touch that guy." When a disease is so terrifying that even monks, whose job is basically to help the dying, start saying, "Yeah, no thanks. You know it's bad." During the height of smallpox outbreaks, many monks simply refused to enter the sick rooms. Some blamed it on spiritual reasons, others on their extremely low tolerance for pus. Either way, the result was the same. Sick people left to face their final hours alone, with nothing but their pustules and regrets for company. Imagine lying in a dark, damp room, covered in oozing blisters, whispering prayers to the ceiling while the monastery courtyard remained suspiciously silent. Occasionally, a monk might slide a bowl of soup in with a stick, then retreat faster than a cat from bathwater. It wasn't cowardice. Okay, maybe a little. It was self-preservation mixed with medieval healthcare standards, which hovered somewhere between do your best and hope for a miracle. The result? Dying alone became tragically common, because in the Middle Ages, if smallpox didn't get you, loneliness just might. In times of plague, fear often outweighed love, even for one's own child. During smallpox outbreaks, stories emerged of newborns being abandoned, not because their parents were cruel, but because they were terrified. A baby's tiny sneeze could send an entire household into chaos. Mothers, driven by desperation, would leave infants outside monasteries, wrap them in rags, and pray that someone else would take the risk. It wasn't heartlessness. It was survival panic in full medieval mode. Some villagers tied signs to babies reading, "Not infected," probably, as if that would help. Meanwhile, monks who had just refused to enter sick rooms now found themselves running an accidental daycare. Of course, not all children were abandoned. Many were hidden in attics, basements, or chicken coops in the hope that fresh air, hay, or holy chickens might ward off disease. The tragedy was silent and invisible. No mass grave, no weeping procession, just a basket left by the door, and a hope that someone, somewhere, might be brave enough to care. In the middle of the smallpox nightmare, a bizarre tale made the rounds in taverns and trenches alike. The story of a soldier who survived not because of medicine or prayer, but because he slipped and fell into a mud puddle. Yes, mud. While his comrades were covered in fever and pustules, He lay half submerged in a freezing, sludgy ditch for 2 days. And when they pulled him out expecting a corpse, he was miraculously fine. The mud had somehow protected him, or so the legend went. Ever since, some folks tried mud baths, swamp dips, and even rolling in manure, hoping to copy his luck. Spoiler, it didn't work. But that one soldier became a walking miracle, a mascot of hope wrapped in damp socks and dirt. His story lives on as a medieval example of, well, it worked once, kind of. The kind of tale desperate people cling to when science hasn't caught up yet. In every pandemic, there's always someone to blame, especially if they look, dress, or worship differently. During the smallpox outbreak, certain minority communities became scapegoats faster than you could say blister. Rumors spread like wildfire. They poisoned the wells, or they summoned demons. Before you knew it, angry mobs with torches and zero medical training were knocking on doors. Some unlucky towns even held witch trials for anyone who sneezed with an unfamiliar accent. It didn't matter that smallpox didn't care about race, language, or religion. Panic did. Entire neighborhoods were attacked, ransacked, and even burned down. It was a medieval version of blame first, think never. Historians today look back at this with a collective facepalm, reminding us that fear mixed with ignorance often leads to cruelty. So while the disease was merciless, the response of society could be just as deadly and a lot less justified. Winter in the Middle Ages was already rough. Cold toes, frozen soup, and that one guy who wouldn't stop playing the lute indoors. But add smallpox to the mix, and you've got a recipe for disaster. As temperatures dropped, people huddled together in cramped rooms, all breathing the same smoky, germ-filled air. Fireplaces were the medieval version of group chat. Everyone gathered, shared gossip, and unknowingly, viral particles. The virus loved winter. It didn't care about holiday cheer. It cared that your cousin Bert coughed on a roasted turnip and now grandma is covered in pustules. Doctors noticed this seasonal spike but couldn't quite explain it, blaming bad air or angry winter spirits. No one dared open a window. They feared cold drafts more than airborne contagion. Ironically, the coziest moments became the deadliest. In the quest to stay warm, entire households went down together, united in love, laughter, and blistering infection. In a time when painkillers were as mythical as dragons, desperate patients with smallpox turned to the next best thing: booze. Yes, alcohol was the medieval miracle cure for everything from heartbreak to pustules. Uncle Gregor, covered in sores and delusions, would chug homemade mead in hopes it would burn the sickness out. Spoiler, it didn't. Instead, many ended up with alcohol poisoning on top of smallpox, a truly legendary combo. Some even thought wine baths could draw the disease out, which just left them sticky, dizzy, and still blistering. Meanwhile, local taverns cashed in, selling medicinal ale by the barrel, claiming it had been blessed by monks. It wasn't. Town criers warned against excessive drinking. But who listens to the guy yelling in the street when your face looks like a bubbling stew? Thus, in their search for relief, many turned their livers into collateral damage, proving that even in the worst of times, humans never gave up on the dream of a miracle shot of schnapps. When smallpox struck, medieval disinfection efforts were, let's just say, dramatic. Forget hand sanitizer or bleach. Their go-to move was fire. If a patient died, their bed, clothes, and sometimes the entire room were promptly set ablaze. Aunt Matilda's feather mattress? Up in smoke. Uncle Bernard's favorite cloak? Bye-bye, fashion. The logic? If the disease couldn't survive flames, neither should your furniture. Sometimes, entire homes were torched, just to be safe, resulting in neighborhoods that looked more post-apocalyptic than plague preventive. Town officials organized burn squads, who'd arrive with torches and zero sympathy, shouting sanitation, while villagers cried over their smoking heirlooms. It was the medieval equivalent of rage quitting your whole living space, and while it did help reduce some contagion, it also increased the local demand for new beds, clothes, and occasionally houses. Who knew staying healthy might cost you your favorite armchair, and maybe the whole cottage? Desperate times call for desperate measures, or in the case of early smallpox experimentation, wildly risky ones. Some medieval physicians noticed that survivors of mild cases never caught smallpox again. So, in a moment of bold and frankly reckless genius, they decided to try spreading the mild version on purpose. How? By scraping pus from a recovering patient and gently introducing it into healthy folks, preferably kids, because why not gamble with the future? These doctors believed it was better to get a little sick now than horribly sick later. It was like playing medieval roulette with a spoonful of infection. Some patients indeed got lucky and developed immunity. Others, well, not so much. It was the earliest form of vaccination, minus the sterile needles and scientific understanding. Still, it laid the groundwork for the revolutionary idea that you could fight a disease by carefully giving someone a bit of it first. Medicine or madness? Maybe both. Sometimes mothers are braver than armies. One legendary tale tells of a mother who, armed with nothing but love and a questionable medical instinct, decided to protect her child from smallpox using the DIY method of the century. She carefully scraped a tiny bit of pus from a recovering neighbor's blister and, deep breath, rubbed it onto a small cut on her child's arm. No sterile gloves, no doctor, just sheer maternal determination. The idea? Let the kid catch a light version and become immune. Risky? Extremely. Effective? Surprisingly, yes, in many cases. This bold mom wasn't alone. Other parents soon followed, turning household immunization into an underground trend. These unsung pioneers of backyard biology laid the emotional, and slightly gross, groundwork for what would later become vaccination. All this because one mom thought, if my kid's going to get sick, better now and mild than later and deadly. A gamble wrapped in a hug. After a few gutsy mothers and experimental healers gave it a try, something miraculous began to happen. Some kids who got the mild pus treatment actually survived the smallpox waves unscathed. These early successes weren't just lucky flukes. They were statistical gold in a time of superstition. Word spread fast through whispers and kitchen gossip. Hey, that neighbor's kid got the scratchy pus thing and didn't even get sick. Of course, not every case ended well. A few scratches turned into hospital-grade disasters. But for once, hope was not just a prayer. It had pimples and a strategy. Local village leaders, curious nobles, and even a few skeptical monks started to pay attention. Could this gooey gamble really be the future of medicine? Suddenly, amid all the medieval madness, people started thinking, maybe science wasn't just for alchemists and guys with fancy beards. It was messy, yes. It was gross, absolutely. But it was also the first awkward step towards something truly revolutionary. Immunity, homemade addition. Just when hope started to flicker thanks to a few successful inoculation cases, the community collectively screamed, wait, you're giving kids the disease on purpose? Panic spread faster than the plague itself. Church bells rang not for prayer, but for protest. Mothers clutched their children like they were shielding them from a fire-breathing dragon made of pus. Street debates broke out, with local gossips turning into full-blown conspiracy theorists. My cousin's goat died right after that boy got inoculated. Coincidence? I think not. Even well-meaning priests warned that tampering with illness was tampering with God's will. The poor healers who tried to help suddenly found themselves being pelted with turnips, or worse, theological arguments. Meanwhile, in secret, some villagers still dared to try the method, whispering like they were part of an underground rebellion. Welcome to the world's first anti-vaccine movement. Pitchforks, paranoia, and plenty of pustules. With pitchforks raised and rumors flying wilder than pigeons at a bakery, some towns outright banned the inoculation experiments. No more devil pus in our kids, they shouted while nailing decrees to doors. Yet not all healers gave up. In candlelit basements, behind haystack walls, and sometimes in the back rooms of bakeries, because why not? A few brave physicians continued their experiments in secret. These underground pus smugglers dodged authorities like medieval ninjas, armed not with swords, but with vials of hope and an alarming amount of gauze. They whispered like rebels plotting a kingdom-wide coup. Tonight, we inoculate little Thomas, after the cows are asleep. While the public fumed, these rogue medics planted the early seeds of modern immunology. Ironically, in a time when most people believed sneezing was sorcery, science was quietly sneaking in through the barn door. As the plague raged on, something unexpected happened. A few noble families tried the new pus trick and survived. Suddenly, what was once considered peasant witchcraft became cutting-edge royal science. Courtiers whispered, "Did you hear? The Duke's son had a scab rubbed into his arm and he's still alive." This turned into a medieval fashion trend among the upper crust. "Have you been inoculated yet?" became the 18th century version of, "Did you get the latest iPhone?" Royal doctors strutted through castles with swollen egos and tiny wooden boxes of infectious goo. Of course, some nobles still refused. "I'd rather die than rub peasant pus into my bloodstream," they cried, clutching lace handkerchiefs. But as survival stories piled up, skepticism started to wane. For the first time, the plague of smallpox met a worthy opponent: upper-class peer pressure. With noble families quietly surviving thanks to early inoculation, the public debate took off like a runaway cart. Was this miracle truly science, or just another medieval superstition wrapped in fancy robes? On one side stood the skeptics, priests warning of divine punishment, old women swearing by garlic baths, and barbers insisting leeches were still superior. On the other side, physicians with magnifying glasses and thick scrolls, shouting Latin words while poking peasants' arms. The town square turned into a battlefield of opinions, posters, sermons, heated tavern debates. One man yelled, "If pus is the answer, then my goat is a genius," while another cried, "Long live Lady Smallpox if it means no witchery." Amid the noise, the idea of controlled infections sparked a revolution, dividing families, neighborhoods, and even royal courts. And so began the Middle Ages' most surprising intellectual fight: science versus sorcery, with pus as the main contender. And so, smallpox left a legacy that was scarred into both flesh and history. With its trail of pitted faces and devastated villages, it did more than terrify. It inspired. The chaotic experiments with pus and needle eventually lit the spark for the concept of vaccines. While some still believed in leeches and prayers, others began seeing illness not as punishment from angry gods, but as a puzzle science could solve. The battle between superstition and science gave rise to something humanity desperately needed: hope. Doctors began thinking bigger. What if we could prevent other diseases too? What if future generations didn't have to hide their faces behind masks or scars? Thanks to the horrifying reign of smallpox, medicine was forced to evolve, not by choice, but by sheer desperation. And while it wouldn't be until centuries later that the disease was officially eradicated, the Middle Ages had unknowingly laid the foundation for one of humanity's greatest triumphs: the vaccine. All thanks to a little pustule with big consequences. Welcome to a brand new chapter of medieval misery: cholera, the invisible assassin hiding in every sip of water. Unlike the dramatic flare of the plague or the flashy boils of smallpox, cholera was a silent killer. No rats, no sneezing, just an innocent gulp from the village well, and boom, explosive diarrhea, total dehydration, and a one-way ticket to the afterlife. The worst part? No one suspected water. It was like getting betrayed by your best friend. Villagers kept sipping, sharing, and cooking with the same contaminated source while scratching their heads, wondering why everyone looked like dried-up figs. In a world that believed more in demons than bacteria, cholera thrived like a ninja, unseen and unstoppable. So before we dive deeper into the watery nightmare, take a moment to hydrate, with clean water preferably, and smash that like button. Share your thoughts. Tell us what medieval horror you'd survive or not. Embrace yourself for another flood of absurd, tragic, and occasionally hilarious misfortunes from the good old days. Before cholera made its grand entrance in medieval Europe, it had already earned a deadly reputation along the sacred banks of the Ganges River in India. What started as a mysterious illness that turned people into dried raisins overnight soon hitched a ride with traders, pilgrims, and the occasional spice merchant. Thanks to bustling trade routes, the disease elegantly made its way across the Middle East and eventually strutted into Europe like a plague on a business trip. No passports, no invitations, just diarrhea diplomacy in action. Medieval folks, already grappling with leprosy and the Black Death, now had a new enemy that didn't even knock. By the time European cities realized something was wrong, they were knee-deep in both sewage and sorrow. The water looked clear, tasted fine, and still managed to kill faster than a sword. And so, from the Ganges to the Thames, cholera spread silently, but efficiently, like a bad rumor with excellent legs. In medieval towns where pigs shared alleyways with people and chamber pots flew from windows like missiles, hygiene was basically a myth. Enter cholera, a disease that adored such filthy hospitality. It spread through contaminated water with the speed of gossip in a nunnery. Wells, rivers, buckets, even that suspicious-looking communal soup. No liquid source was safe. The fewer bathrooms there were, the more business the streets got. And when waste and drinking water cohabited like an unhappy couple in a studio apartment, cholera had the perfect launch pad. People thought water was life, but back then it was more like roulette. Every sip could be your last. The disease didn't need rats like the plague or close contact like smallpox. It just needed one unfortunate soul to poop upstream, and boom, downstream disaster. If you were lucky, you only got the runs. If not, well, you ran out of time. Cholera didn't play around. One moment, you were enjoying a suspiciously lukewarm bowl of stew, and the next, boom, your insides turned into a slip and slide. The first symptom? Explosive diarrhea. The second? Dehydration so severe, your eyes looked like raisins and your skin folded like old parchment. People went from sipping water to lying flat in a matter of hours. No time for goodbyes, just a quick trip from outhouse to underworld. The body shriveled, lips turned blue, and villagers whispered, "He drank from the cursed bucket." It wasn't the illness itself that scared people. It was the speed. Blink twice, and the person next to you might already be halfway to medieval heaven. The worst part? There were no warning signs, no fever, no dramatic buildup, just a rapid, watery exit from life. If you had time to say, uh-oh, you were lucky. Despite villagers dropping like flies, no one suspected the real culprit. Water, the same stream that quenched thirst, cleaned feet, and flavored stew, was also quietly hosting a deadly guest. Cholera. Yet day after day, folks kept drawing from the same bucket, offering cups to the sick and healthy alike. A neighbor would collapse after a sip, and people would murmur, "Ska must have been cursed by a jealous goat spirit." Superstitions thrived, but not once did anyone look suspiciously at the murky, tadpole-infested water. Hygiene wasn't a medieval strong suit, and water had always been their trusty companion, until it turned traitor. Meanwhile, the more people drank to flush out the sickness, the more they hastened their own watery doom. Ironically, the only clean liquid around was probably the wine, which no one wanted to waste on hydration. When people began collapsing left and right, medieval healers sprang into action, with incense sticks and prayer scrolls. You see, lacking any knowledge about bacteria, most healers assumed the afflicted were simply possessed. Not by demons of diarrhea, mind you, but literal evil spirits. So they waved burning herbs like they were fighting ghosts, chanted Latin that even they barely understood, and scribbled protective symbols on people's foreheads. A man dying from dehydration? Clearly, he needed more garlic under his bed. A woman vomiting uncontrollably? Must be cursed by a jealous witch. If someone dared to suggest boiling water might help, they were probably the witch. And thus, while cholera ravaged the villages, healers kept busy chasing invisible ghouls, armed with incense, charms, and an impeccable sense of medieval drama. Imagine a peaceful riverside fishing village, where the loudest sound used to be the splash of fish and the occasional drunk uncle snoring in a boat. But within days, that calm was replaced by the sounds of coughing, groaning, and utter chaos. Cholera didn't knock. It barged in like an uninvited guest at a wedding, turning the village into a battlefield. Buckets became toilets, beds became graveyards, and even the chickens looked concerned. Entire families fell ill within hours. The river that once gave life now delivered death in every gulp. People panicked, running to the village healer, who confidently declared it was a curse from water spirits, and then fainted himself. From elders to toddlers, no one was spared. Fishermen threw their nets in desperation, not for fish, but for answers. And as the sun set over the contaminated water, the village, once bustling with laughter, now echoed only silence, except for that one drunk uncle, who was somehow still snoring. And weirdly healthy. After the village fell like dominoes to cholera, the next logical step, according to medieval logic, was to find someone to blame and shake a few rattles. So the villagers flocked to the local shaman, a wide-eyed man in robes made from suspicious animal skins, who declared the river had been cursed by angry water spirits. He began a cleansing ritual involving chicken feathers, incense, and a very off-key chant that even scared the chickens. Not satisfied, others turned to the village witch, an old woman who lived with 10 cats and swore that burying garlic at the riverbank would appease the spirits. The people, desperate for any hope, did both. Soon the entire village smelled like burned herbs and boiled garlic. And the disease? Still going strong. But at least now everyone was too busy coughing or running from smoke to notice. In the middle of all this chaos, someone asked, "What if it's just the water?" But he was quickly shushed. Superstition had a louder voice than reason back then. In times of crisis, nothing brings people together like a nice warm meal. Unfortunately, in this village, that meal was a giant pot of rice porridge, served with a side of vibrio cholerae. One family invited their neighbors over for a comforting dinner, thinking food would lift spirits. Spirits were indeed lifted, straight to the afterlife. Within 48 hours, the entire extended family and guests had collapsed. The only survivor? A toddler who threw a tantrum and refused to eat. Suddenly, picky eating became a life-saving strategy. Word spread fast. Don't share food or you'll share the fate. But it was too late. Several households following the same recipe for disaster went silent. The porridge pot sat in the middle of the courtyard, still warm, as chickens pecked at it cluelessly. That one meal became infamous, a culinary curse whispered about for generations. Lesson learned: during a mysterious plague, potluck dinners are a terrible idea. As the village fell deeper into despair, the question arose, what to do with the growing number of bodies? The answer apparently was nothing. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. No one dared to dig graves or organize burials. Instead, the deceased were wrapped in cloth and quietly placed by the stream, out of sight, out of mind, and unfortunately directly into the water source. The logic? If the spirits took them, maybe they'd take the disease too. But all they took was the last ounce of common sense. Soon the stream turned from a source of life to a floating parade of the dearly departed. Fishermen refused to cast nets. Children were banned from playing near the banks. Even the ducks started looking for cleaner ponds, but the water kept flowing, carrying sorrow and bacteria downstream. It was a medieval version of sweeping it under the rug, except the rug was liquid and full of pathogens. While most villagers fell one by one, a curious pattern emerged. There was a small group of survivors who seemed oddly tipsy. Turns out they hadn't touched river water in weeks, not because they suspected cholera, but because they preferred wine, mead, or whatever fermented liquid was on hand. In fact, the local drunk, previously mocked for talking to trees and singing to goats, suddenly became the healthiest man in the village. People began asking him for medical advice, which mostly involved drinking more. One woman even started bathing her baby in wine, just to be safe. Soon, wine jars were emptied faster than prayers were said. Was it science? Was it luck? No one knew. But for a brief, absurd moment, alcoholism looked like the key to survival. Cheers, medieval style. With the village healers out of ideas, and some out of town, desperate villagers turned to monasteries as the last hope. The monks, known more for copying scriptures than curing diseases, suddenly found themselves running medieval emergency rooms. They turned prayer halls into sick bays and holy water into, well, not so holy fluids shared by everyone. Despite their good intentions, the lack of medical knowledge quickly turned the place into a pray and hope facility. Monks tried to treat cholera with herbs, hymns, and excessive amounts of incense, which only made everyone cough harder. Some even believed the more you prayed, the less you'd poop, scientifically unproven, but spiritually ambitious. Soon the monastery was overwhelmed, with monks running around holding chamber pots like knights on a toilet crusade. It was chaos in robes, and surprisingly, the goats that lived nearby were the only ones staying healthy. While many ran from the plague, a few ran toward it, robes, sandals, and all. These were the brave monks and priests who chose to stay behind in infected villages and monasteries to care for the sick. Armed with nothing but compassion and questionable herbal remedies, they held hands with the dying, whispered prayers, and occasionally got sneezed on mid-sermon. Unsurprisingly, many of them fell ill themselves. But unlike the nobles who locked their castle gates and the merchants who vanished with their carts, these holy caretakers were remembered. Villagers began calling them blessed martyrs, saints in sandals who faced death with a rosary in one hand and a bucket in the other. Tales of their courage spread faster than the disease. Finally, something contagious that wasn't fatal. Some were even painted into church murals, always glowing, and suspiciously not vomiting. After weeks of watching villagers drop like flies and rivers turn into liquid doom, someone finally had a revolutionary idea. What if we cleaned the water first? Thus began the first awkward attempts at water purification. One group tried boiling water, accidentally inventing lukewarm tea. Another mixed ashes into clay pots to filter out the evil spirits. The results were mixed. The water still tasted terrible, but at least it wasn't immediately deadly. Elders argued over which firewood made the cleanest boil, and someone tried filtering with an old sock. Creative, but disgusting. Despite the chaos, this marked the dawn of a concept that would eventually save millions. Of course, back then, it just saved Uncle Jero, who stopped having diarrhea after drinking ash water. From superstition came innovation, with a pinch of burnt bark. Some medieval artists documented the horrors of cholera not through words, but through haunting imagery. And by haunting, we mean wildly dramatic and slightly exaggerated. These paintings depicted ghostly figures curled up by village wells, with eyes sunken like forgotten raisins and limbs twisted in cartoonishly tragic poses. One image showed a man so thin he could slip through a fence. Another captured a woman lying dramatically on a pile of laundry, because nothing says deadly illness like theatrical drapery. Artists didn't spare the gruesome details, bulging bellies, pale faces, and the occasional black crow for atmosphere. These artworks terrified villagers, inspired more panic than prayer, and somehow still ended up hanging in public halls. Perhaps the idea was, if cholera didn't kill you, the painting might. When boiling water and sock filters weren't enough, some medieval towns decided to go full lockdown, on the wells. Guards were posted at public wells like they were guarding royal treasure. Access was denied to anyone who looked even slightly sweaty. Desperate citizens were told to collect rainwater or, in holier areas, use blessed water from the church, which led to a strange phenomenon: people praying for rain. Villagers placed buckets on rooftops and performed the first ever rain dances in Europe. Awkward, offbeat, but surprisingly effective during storm season. One overly devout group even claimed that water from a certain priest's bath cured stomach cramps, though it mysteriously smelled like garlic. Whether holy, heavenly, or just slightly moldy, water became the new currency, and the guy with a clean barrel suddenly had more friends than the local baker. With wells locked and panic bubbling, people needed someone to blame. And who better than traveling merchants? These poor souls, already lugging spices, silks, and questionable pottery, suddenly became the prime suspects for spreading cholera. They come from far away. They must bring the curse, shouted villagers who hadn't bathed in weeks. Some merchants were chased out of town with pitchforks and broomsticks, while others were forced to display clean water certificates written by local monks who couldn't spell cholera. Markets emptied, trade froze, and the local baker cried because nobody brought cinnamon anymore. One merchant tried to sell holy water-infused vinegar as a cure and got banned for witchcraft through commerce. In the end, the fear of disease did what taxes couldn't. It shut down capitalism, medieval style. As fear of cholera intensified, some villagers took matters into their own hands by digging private wells in secret. But in a society where logic took a back seat to superstition, this act wasn't seen as practical, it was seen as suspicious. Why would someone want their own water? Unless they're hoarding it for dark rituals. Soon whispers turned to accusations. Those with clean water were branded as water witches, not because they cast spells, but because their families didn't drop like flies. One elderly woman with a backyard well was tied to a post and forced to explain why her water didn't scream when sprinkled with holy ash. A young man was chased for daring to install a wooden lid on his well. Some were fined, others banished, and a few faced the fire. And so, once again, clean water became not just rare, but deadly. Amid panic and superstition, hope came in the form of plants. Villagers desperate for remedies turned to herbalists, those odd neighbors who always smelled like basil and owned suspiciously well-organized gardens. Some herbs like peppermint, ginger, and dried blackberry leaves were boiled into bitter teas that surprisingly helped ease mild diarrhea. Suddenly, herbalists became unlikely heroes, until someone asked, why are their families healthy while others suffer? Suspicion returned, but this time with a side of admiration. Villagers began to barter. 1 chicken for a bundle of dried chamomile, 2 eggs for a mysterious root shaped like a frog. Recipes spread like wildfire. Boiled mint with goat milk, roasted garlic and honey, or 7-leaf soup that tasted like lawn clippings, but kept your stomach calm. No one knew exactly why some herbs worked, but when you're on your 7th trip to the outhouse, you'll try anything leafy. After weeks of herbal experiments and panicked prayers, something miraculous happened. Someone had the idea to boil water before drinking it. At first, villagers thought he'd gone mad. Boil water? What's next? Roasting air? But when his family stopped making daily visits to the outhouse, others took notice. Soon, big pots bubbled across the village, with kettles whistling like battle horns. Even the village idiot declared, hot water good, cold water bad, and was hailed as a prophet. This new boiling ritual became trendy. Housewives exchanged recipes for double-boiled spring dew, and overachievers added herbs for flavor and bonus burps. Accidental discoveries were made, like steam baths curing more than just stomach issues. Slowly, unintentionally, the villagers stumbled upon hygiene, not through science, but through sheer desperation and a love for hot tea. And for once, being a bit paranoid paid off. After boiling water became the village's latest craze, curiosity led to something even stranger. Dissections. That's right. A few daring doctors decided to slice open the dearly departed to find out what had actually gone wrong. These weren't trained physicians, mind you. One was a butcher, another a former dentist who'd only pulled teeth from goats. They laid the bodies on old barn tables, held their noses, and got to work. What they found shocked them. Bodies as dry as firewood, with organs shriveled like old apples. They didn't die from curses, they dried up like overcooked bacon, someone exclaimed. Notes were scribbled in chicken scratch, diagrams drawn on flour sacks. The church wasn't too thrilled, of course, and labeled the practice morbid curiosity, but the seed of medical inquiry had been planted. Ironically, it took a bunch of desperate villagers and a few brave goat dentists to realize that maybe, just maybe, science wasn't witchcraft. After discovering the bodies were bone dry like medieval beef jerky, the village's brain trust, mostly former barbers and goat dentists, had a radical idea. What if they could put the water back in? Thus, the earliest concept of intravenous therapy was born. Of course, they didn't have syringes, saline, or even a basic clue, so they improvised. Goose feathers, hollow reeds, animal bladders tied with string. One daring experiment involved pouring watered-down wine into a goat vein. Don't ask why. Another genius tried attaching a soaked pig intestine to a wooden funnel and declaring, "Let the healing begin." The patients didn't get better, but the inventors were too excited to notice. The idea was there, restore lost fluids. But the technology, not quite. Still, these hilarious and horrifying prototypes laid the earliest groundwork for something modern medicine would eventually take seriously. For now, though, they just created very confused goats. While villagers were busy poking goat veins and boiling puddles, one observant monk began noticing something others ignored: the path from poop to pitcher. He started mapping out who got sick and when, drawing lines from the latrine behind the church to the communal well. Every arrow screamed, "Maybe don't drink downstream from diarrhea." His fellow monks laughed it off. Brother Anselm and his poop charts again. But he persisted. He even documented how outbreaks followed heavy rain when waste washed into the well. Slowly, the wild idea emerged. Maybe illness didn't come from curses, but from contamination. It was the first flicker of what we now call epidemiology. Of course, no one used that word yet. They just called him that toilet-obsessed monk. But thanks to his nose-holding dedication and suspicious mind, the idea that disease could spread through filth took root. Science didn't arrive with fireworks. It stumbled in with a map, a latrine, and a monk who drew way too many arrows. With the monk's poop map making waves, some villages decided to take water matters into their own stone basins. One genius blacksmith built a tank filled with layers, gravel, sand, and even ash from the fireplace. His neighbors looked on with suspicion. What's he doing? Seasoning his water? But when fewer people around his house got sick, curiosity spread faster than cholera. Soon, every other house had its own DIY filter setup. Some worked, some were just buckets with holes. Kids were assigned to stir the top layer with sticks, because science. While no one fully understood the why, they all agreed, if the water smells less like goat feet, it's probably safer. These primitive filtration systems, made with whatever was lying around, laid the muddy foundation for future water purification. And so, in a world where curses were blamed for disease, it took rocks, sand, and a stubborn blacksmith to nudge society closer to science, one bucket at a time. In a remote corner of the village, far from the noisy blacksmiths and poop-obsessed monks, lived a quiet old woman named Marga. When the cholera hit, she didn't pray, scream, or build stone filters. She made tea, ginger tea to be exact. Every morning she'd boil a kettle, toss in some dried ginger, mutter something about spicy roots chasing out evil, and sip it like she had all the time in the world. Her neighbors, meanwhile, were collapsing left and right. But Marga, fit as a fiddle. Word spread. People lined up outside her hut, begging for a taste of her miracle brew. She never claimed it cured anything, just that it was warm, tasty, and didn't come from the river. Soon, villagers ditched dirty well water and started boiling tea leaves, flowers, anything remotely edible. Thus began the great medieval tea craze, where ginger was worth more than gold, and tea time became less about biscuits and more about survival. Brother Theobald had survived 3 waves of cholera, not because of divine protection or miracle tea. No, he simply refused to drink anything he didn't boil himself. By the 3rd outbreak, he was the only monk left in the abbey. His daily routine: ring the morning bell, write in his diary, boil water, bury someone, repeat. His journal entries gradually turned from hopeful prayers to exhausted sarcasm. Day 9, Brother Paul thought sprinkling garlic water on his feet would help. It did not. Day 15, the village council is now just me, a goat, and a bucket of ashes. Despite the chaos, he kept documenting everything: the symptoms, the deaths, the odd remedies. One page even had a detailed drawing of a villager trying to drink rain straight from a chicken's back. In the end, Brother Theobald wasn't just a survivor. He was a chronicler of absurdity, tragedy, and the stubborn will to live with a quill and boiling pot. Long before Google Maps or GPS, medieval folks had their own version of tracking chaos: the plague map. After 3 brutal cholera waves, some overly ambitious monks and scribes began drawing what looked like treasure maps, except instead of gold, they marked death. Red skulls for villages wiped out, black circles for suspected contaminated wells, and arrows pointing to suspicious goats. Don't ask. These maps weren't exactly scientific, but they helped visualize the horror. Brother Eamon, a cartography enthusiast with shaky hands and even shakier Latin, proudly unveiled his grand map to the town. Here be death, and here, and here. Oh, and avoid this river unless you fancy dying with style. While not everyone could read, the terrifying symbols did the trick. Soon, villagers passed them around like gossip scrolls. These rough sketches marked the beginning of medieval epidemiology, equal parts helpful, hopeful, and hilariously inaccurate. But hey, it's hard to map a disease when people still think it's caused by bad smells and moon phases. Centuries after cholera had terrorized medieval villages, science finally caught up, and it brought a microscope. In the 19th century, a German physician named Robert Koch looked at a water sample under a lens and shouted, probably in German, "Aha!" There it was, a tiny comma-shaped bacterium wiggling like it owned the place. Vibrio cholerae, the invisible villain of centuries past, had been unmasked. Scientists stared in awe and mild disgust. It didn't breathe fire or wear a cloak, but it was deadly all the same. This discovery changed everything. For the first time, people stopped blaming moon phases, cursed goats, or unlucky air, and instead blamed actual germs. The ghost stories faded, and germ theory took center stage. Water was no longer judged by taste or holy blessings, but by whether it hosted microscopic murderers. The Middle Ages may have feared what they couldn't see, but modern science, it just zoomed in and took notes. Even after microscopes exposed Vibrio cholerae and modern science caught up, cholera refused to pack its bags. Like an unwanted guest, it kept returning, 19th century, 20th, even today in some corners of the world. The Middle Ages may be long gone, but cholera seems to have a time-traveling hobby. It mutated, adapted, and hitched rides on ships, trains, and eventually airplanes. Cities with poor sanitation got hit hardest, and once again, the water turned into a lottery of life or death. Governments panicked, newspapers screamed, and modern citizens reacted the same way their medieval ancestors did, by pointing fingers and hoarding bottled water. The irony, we now understand how it spreads, how to prevent it, and how to treat it, but it still manages to sneak through cracks in public health systems, like a bacteria-sized ninja. So yes, we've come a long way from blaming goats and moonlight, but cholera? It's still lurking, just waiting for another chance to crash the party. And so we reach the end of our medieval misadventure, where danger didn't wear armor, it wore aprons, helmets, mining hats, and occasionally, bird masks. Whether it was the foot soldier charging into chaos, the miner digging through death, the blacksmith sweating near molten metal, or the healer accidentally poisoning patients with good intentions, they all shared one thing: an incredible amount of pain, perseverance, and pure absurdity. These weren't just jobs. They were daily risks to life and limb. Then came the plagues. The Black Death swept through like a dark tide. Leprosy turned victims into outcasts. Smallpox burned across faces and borders. And cholera transformed water itself into a killer. Each disease carved its own horrifying chapter into the book of human history. Yet from the ashes of fear and superstition, something stubbornly beautiful grew. Progress. We learned. We adapted. We stopped drinking from the cursed well. So next time you're annoyed at slow Wi-Fi or lukewarm coffee, remember, at least your tap water doesn't try to murder you.